Hello, and welcome to a special peripatetic edition of Recall This Book with your light-footed host, John Plotz. The conversation you're about to hear took place in Odense, Denmark, just after a conference called Love, Etc. I'm sorry to report that conference was a lot less risque than it sounds, and in my case, the love was mainly for the city's incredible marzipan. And a little bit for the very cute Hans Christian Andersen house. But anyway, as the conference was ending, I was lucky enough to track down two of its star participants. Rita Felski, who organized the conference and is the Niels Bohr Professor of Literature at the University of Southern Denmark, is also a revered literary theorist, author of such influential works as The Uses of Literature and Limits of Critique. Namwali Serpell, an English professor at UC Berkeley, recently published her first novel, The Old Drift, and her short story, The Sack, won the 2015 Caine Prize for African Fiction in English. So, among other things, our conversation explored what happens, both cognitively and emotionally, when we get drawn into a work of art, begin to think with or think as somebody else. And the three of us also discussed whether Zadie Smith's recent article in defense of fiction in the New York Review of Books is right to find in fiction a basis for empathy between actual human beings.
I think that we had an interesting conversation at lunch on the first day, prompted sort of by just the kind of like ambient question of love, about whether or not we teach books that we love, or are we ever willing to teach books that we hate, etc. And there were varying opinions about it. I personally don't teach books that I love because I want to preserve the aesthetic experience. I don't even want to talk about Howard's End to anybody because I'm like, I know I will find a flaw in something that I once found perfect, and I want to preserve that feeling. So there's this way in which the conversation about teaching has kind of hovered around the conference. And one book that I found I came to love after teaching it. So I didn't like it at first, but teaching attuned me to it.
Yes.
Was Never Let Me Go. So it was a contemporary novel class, and it felt like a good novel to teach. In fact, I hadn't taught it the first time. I gave students an option of either reading that or reading Marilyn Robinson's Gilead. And most students chose Never Let Me Go. So the next time I taught the class, I taught Never Let Me Go. And teaching it, lecturing on it, attuned me to things about it that reading it on my own, or even reading about it, even reading the all the glowing reviews did not do. So it's almost the opposite of what most people think, which is that to teach something is to destroy it. And it's also something that I had thought before. But somehow that you can have an attunement process through close reading and through teaching.
Absolutely. Now that's something I've been thinking a lot about too, that this new book I have, it maps out 3 different ways of becoming attached. And one's identification with its various dimensions. One's this idea of attunement. And the third is this idea of interpretation, meaning the classroom and research, but focusing well on the classroom. And, as Namwali was just saying, we tend to have this assumption that, that we or the students arrive with these attachments, and then there's somehow... then we lose the attachments by learning to interpret. And of course that can happen sometimes too.
I think that's Michael Warner's argument in Uncritical Reading. It's like a subtle argument at the beginning, and then it ends up being like, you just have to choose between one.
Right. But the point is also to say that through interpretation and through academic means, you often acquire new attachments, obviously. And not just the students, but also the teachers. I say someone, is dragooned into teaching an intro to literary studies class, and they suddenly develop, a new attachment of Stella Dallas or something, that suddenly this film becomes interesting. Or a grad student arrives at a university, thinking of themselves a modernist, and they have an amazing class on Chaucer. Now they become medievalists. So interpretation is also a means to new attachments rather than simply a quelching of attachments.
I think, so Zadie Smith, a couple of weeks ago, published this article about fiction in the New York Review of Books, but then, Namwali, you had written this article in March, The Banality of Empathy, which, won my heart immediately because you quoted a passage I constantly quote on representative thinking, and, the way that, I'm going to schematize but try not to reduce, you're interested in the way that we could think of imagination without automatically jumping to empathy or the emotive dimension, or, not feeling with but thinking with is what you're interested in investigating. And then, one could or could not connect that to Zadie Smith's,
real, like I'm not going to say it's a predictable novelist's defense of novels, but I mean it's a novelist's defense of novels that comes out of her belonging to a realist tradition that wants, inner other lives to be available to us in fiction in the way that Catherine Gallagher says fiction's been doing since, the 18th century or something. Right. So, yeah. Yeah,
I mean, I think Smith is following the kind of... Zadie Smith is following the tradition from George Eliot, who gets that from Adam Smith to a certain extent. Like the idea of sympathy. And
can you say one sentence more about that? Because I completely am with you, but just the genealogy of that.
Well, I mean, I don't know if Zadie Smith has written about Middlemarch, but I think at least I would characterize some of her novels have the quality of the 19th century novel that... On Beauty definitely does. I think White Teeth was called Dickensian, right? So there's clearly like a novelistic influence there as well. And even to the extent that NW is a tribute to Woolf, still the idea of inner consciousness is primary there. But it does seem to me that I think the word empathy doesn't appear in her essay. I think she uses the word compassion. And I would actually say that the reason that I find Arendt interesting to think about alongside this tradition of empathy being the primary or at least most efficacious way that the novel intersects with ethics is less that it's about thinking with and not feeling with, and more that it is about thinking and feeling with rather than thinking and feeling as, right? So the idea of projecting into someone else, I see as having a kind of rapacity to it and a kind of overwhelming assumption of the other person in both senses, that you are assuming you can get inside them, but also when you get inside them, you actually are eradicating the difference, the distance that Arendt finds so important to maintain in order to think and feel with other people. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I'm going to give you some phrases. I think, Namwali, you mentioned you were struck by these phrases, but in terms of what she's doing, I agree. I heard compassion too, but she also proposes interpersonal voyeurism, profound other fascination, and the last one is the most science fictional, but it's interesting. Cross-epidermal reanimation, which really does sound subsumptive in the way you're describing.
But I liked that move. So this is like this rhetorical move of saying, instead of saying cultural appropriation, which is this kind of calcified phrase that we bandy about, kind of like we lob back and forth like a weapon between different kind of factions, right? Yeah. She's like, well, what if we called it these other things? How would we feel about it? And I sort of wish she had kept going, because those terms have built into them the creepiness and the bizarreness of the desire for empathy, which I think is very human. So it's maybe, say the first one again.
Interpersonal
voyeurism, right? It's got a creepiness to it. Totally, but I think that's accurate. I think that's right. Yeah. And she starts the essay by saying, I used to feel weird about that, but then I realized novelists do it. And so I felt more comfortable. Yeah. All of that seems fine to me. Yeah. But at the end of the essay, she's saying, the fact that I do it as a novelist is ethically good. And that's when I'm like, well, now we're just justifying being novelists to a point where we've lost the creepy sense that actually I think could use more investigation. The term that came up today that I really liked, that I thought could have been another substitute for the desire to be in the other or, think about the other from the inside, that came up in your talk, was xenophilia, right? Instead of xenophobia, it's like the desire for the other, the desire for difference. And that's not something that I think we need to eradicate as human beings, but I do think it's something we need to be careful about.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, this word empathy. I mean, I guess the question, which is being raised partly, is, when we are empathizing, whatever that might involve, and perhaps we need to talk more about that, does that in fact mean a complete mind meld, right? Or can it be a partial empathy or a partial identification? And certainly sometimes when people talk about, in fact, actually in the Zadie Smith essay, she sort of says, I became Madame Bovary, I became Anna Karenina. And that, I mean, this may be partly a question of temperament. It may be that it actually does vary quite a lot just at a phenomenological level between people. But I've certainly had kind of strong identifications, various kinds with characters, but I've never felt I was that character. There's always this like both and. Yes, I am that character, but I'm not that character.
Yeah. Well, that's why you and I both like semi-detached as a phrase.
Semi-detached, yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if we press Zadie Smith on that, whether she might agree with us. Because, I do think, let's say one of the chapters in my books talks about identification, and I disagree with the idea that identification requires, or in fact, it's in fact very common that we have that mind meld. Yeah. And I think that's where people disagree. Actually philosophers, so Noel Carroll has written on this, says that identification involves the Vulcan mind meld, referring to Star Trek, therefore it's a bad thing. Yeah. But then other philosophers, like Beres Gort says, well, no, actually, identification is aspectual. You identify with one bit of a person. I discuss a book about gay men talking about identification with divas, and they sort of say, well, I identify with this part of Tina Turner, but not that part of Tina Turner. Right. Yeah. And I do think there is a lot, perhaps that's not invariably the case, and there can be a kind of identification, including empathy, that is kind of all-consuming in problematic ways. But I do think we can also identify in ways that are more partial, and that can include the cognitive as well as the affective, and that's perhaps in some ways more typical than this other model. I'd certainly agree with Namwali, the idea that I think it's now been pretty forcefully debunked, but I guess people keep coming back to it because it's a kind of nice justification for what we do. The idea that literature makes us automatically more empathic, or why are department meetings so unpleasant if that's the case, I don't.
And why can't anthropologists talk to each other?
So I don't think that reading books makes people better people, makes you a better person. That seems to imply that if you're, for example, illiterate, as much of the world is, you can't be a good person, which seems utterly insane to me. Yeah. And so that is a risk with a certain kind of assumption that you have to read George Eliot in order to learn to become empathic. No, I wouldn't go with that at all. Yeah. Yeah. And the other point, with someone like Martha Nussbaum's work, I do respect quite a lot. But it is true that, again, that the examples are cherry-picked, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So you become empathic through reading George Eliot. Do you become more empathic by reading American Psycho? No, right. I don't think you do. Right. Yeah. And so it works much better.
And that debate goes way back, that notion that you're not allowed to write evil characters because that will create evil empathy or something. Right. Sounds like it's another Star Trek plot.
Which, I make the case that reading American Psycho can have bearing on ethics. Right. Mm-hmm. And ethics in a kind of neutral sense. Right. But also, I make the case that it actually can have positive ethics, and not just by virtue of I am not that person, but because of the experience that it puts us through. It teaches us something, I say, about the difficulty we have confronting genuine, bad, inexplicable things in life, what most people call evil. And that in a kind of Nietzschean sense, if you have no recourse to explanation, you actually have to confront how you actually feel about it. Because if you can't reach for it, well, the gods did it, or psychology did it, or whatever. And I think that's something that American Psycho manages through the blankness of that character.
Can I get a back? Oh, sorry.
That's because I'm kind of interested to hear more then say about how that relates, or does it relate to the Knausgard example, right? Because you mentioned Knausgard saying, well, what's interesting, is actually trying to empathize with the totally, the unspeakable, right, with Adolf Hitler, and that in a way might teach you something about the fact you can't just simply other the villainous person, and you have to grapple with it in some way. But you seem sort of unhappy with his line of argument there. Mm-hmm. And so how is that different to the obviously significantly less monstrous character in American Psycho?
Well, just as monstrous. There's
just on a smaller scale.
Right, sure. He's a serial killer, so who knows how far he'll go eventually. But I think, there's a couple of differences. One is the end of projecting into or empathizing with the villain humanizes the villain, and it helps us understand perhaps what it would mean to do these kind of murderous things, these horrible, terrible things. But American Psycho, and this is one difference, is that it is fiction, so it is it allows us actually to experience something that is impossible to experience in life, which is to encounter and be forced to inhabit the perspective of an impossible person. He even says, I'm an impossible, I'm a non-contingent being. Like it doesn't, he actually is not, it's not possible for someone to be as empty as Patrick Bateman is. And he's a construct, and he's sort of a vehicle through which we might do something, through which we might experience something. So, the example that I use is The Women of Bacchus, The Women of Trachis, a play that Bernard Williams reads as, again, having the same Nietzschean upshot, where just like terrible thing after terrible thing happens in the play. And there's this constant like, well, who did it? How did this happen? And it's the one Greek play where it's like the gods didn't do it. It's like we can't blame it on the gods. Okay. It's clearly a construct. This didn't actually happen. It's not a historical event. But the construct itself, Williams argues, puts us in this position where we have no recourse to reason or justice or empathy or emotion. That all we face is the inevitability and grotesque horror of violence.
I wonder if you could read the Book of Job that way too.
I was just thinking that, and not just the Book of Job, but I was thinking of another recent. I lost it. Yeah.
I mean, just because it provides a kind of God comes out and resolves things, but the resolution is considered throughout the history of Christian theology like this unsatisfactory addendum. Yeah.
I mean, and this is one of the things this is one of the reasons that I think the empathy model of fiction is insufficient for me, is that it relies entirely, because it came from realist fiction. So the idea that we're going to analogize ourselves to characters is built on this mimetic principle. When there's so many amazing, interesting things that art can do to our experience affectively and ethically when it's not realism. And I think, Smith knows this, and she wrote this essay, Two Paths for the Novel. She knows that there are affordances in these texts that are not realistic.
But surely, just from the other side, there is a way. I completely agree with the account that, you guys have been giving, that, as far as I understand it, which is that empathy works best with certain kinds of fictional forms and realist character. That seems exactly right to me. And so I'm sort of interested in a way in which there are also other kinds of identification that have nothing to do with empathy. Like when you identify with Camus' Merceau or something, or when you identify with James Bond. There's no empathy in James Bond. You don't find empathy with James Bond. But you can identify with James Bond. So I do think the empathy model, if it works at all, works only with certain kinds of fiction. But, if on the one hand you could say that that there is the connection is less than in real life. In another way, you could say it's more than in real life, I would have thought, because you can get inside people's heads in fiction in a way you never can in real life. You become, something that Doric Cohen talks about, that how weird, we read a novel and we are mind readers. Yeah. We know someone better than you will ever know someone in real life.
That's why I find that argument in Culture of the Diagram about the invention of free and direct discourse so convincing, which is, I think it's Pascal Casanova originally, but that it evolves in 4 different linguistic traditions between 1780 and 1810, and they're not necessarily aware of one another. Like, that's an amazing fact, in terms of how that mind meld happens.
Right. I mean, I do think this is why it's important to recognize that this desire is so deeply human, even if it is perverse and impossible. Because I do think like what writers are doing in Free and Direct as writers is the kind of mind reading they can't do in real life, right? So I mean, and there's this George Eliot story that's about being able to read minds and the problems with that would result if it actually happened. And I think as a writer, I don't feel that I am my characters, but I am closer to understanding what it's like to be inside them than I ever have been with a person I know.
I mean, I'm curious, because I actually hear I've heard quite a few authors say this, And I do think, I want to take what they say at face value and think through its implication. It's kind of interesting to me, but I'm just wondering if you ever had that experience where people say that, authors say their characters do get away from them, and the characters end up doing things they hadn't planned, the author hadn't planned at all. I mean, have you found that? Or?
Yes, I have. And I also have
How to explain it?
Well, so I was just saying earlier in an interview I was doing here that writing for me feels very akin to reading. So, and the way that I know this is when we experience a filmic adaptation and we see Lily Bart and we're like, that's not what she looks like. But I had no idea what Lily Bart looked like when I was reading. I just had an impression, a kind of like fuzzy liliness, right? That is like my understanding. And that's how I see my own characters. If you were to ask me what is the hair color of my novel, of the characters in my novel, I could probably only do half, or there's not, or like if I had to draw like a police sketch or like actually cast a person as a character in my novel, I don't have a very strong visual impression. I have this kind of like fuzzy sense of them as a person. But they do have this quality of radical otherness, of separateness from me, that I think, I don't have children myself, so I don't know if it's like that, where it's like, you're me, but you're not me. But I do know that characters, I've tried to change a character's name once, and it just didn't work. It's like he balked. He was like, that's not my name. I also, because I'm reading my way into creating the novel, it's like I'm writing to see what happens sometimes. It's almost like the novel already exists. And I think the novelist that spoke today, Hannah, was saying a similar thing. It already exists and you are just being led through it or transcribing it. And in that sense, the characters, I learn things about them. So I'll like write a whole dialogue between two characters, and I'll like do a full draft of a novel, and I'll be like, why does he say that? Like, why is he saying that? And then I'll realize, oh, he's bisexual. I just it hadn't occurred to me that that's why he said that in that moment, So it's like this weird way where you're learning them. I mean, and of course, like different writers, Nabokov makes the kind of inappropriate or un-PC pun that his characters are his galley slaves. Yeah. So I know but even he has admits, I think, in other interviews that his characters are not always under his control.
I'm just wondering how distinctive that is to novelists, because I feel like, isn't there a famous Michelangelo line about finding the slave sculpture inside the stone?
Yes,
I'm wondering, because it seems like I've heard, like Rita, I've heard a lot of novelists say this, and it does seem so distinctive to novelists when they say it. And now I'm just wondering, is there...
I think it's the concept of the muse is exactly this. So I feel like it's a very old tradition of thinking about writing and poetry and painting and it's in the canvas and you're just bringing it out. It's very much along those lines.
Well, you guys, thank you. This has been an awesome conversation. I really appreciate it. I appreciate your time, especially at the end of a long et cetera conference. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Recall This Book. As always, thanks go to Brandeis University, to my co-host Elizabeth Ferry, and to our producers Matthew Schratz and Claire Ogden, and our music is courtesy of Eric Cheslow and Barbara Cassidy. See you next time.